podcast. My name is Tim Stoddart. We have a special episode today. We have a guest. We have my new friend, Ben Wilson. Ben is the founder, I guess you could say. He runs one of my new favorite podcasts called How to Take Over the World. I'm thrilled that Ben is taking time to talk with us this afternoon. So Ben, welcome. Great to chat with you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I want to jump right off with the show because we're writers at Copyblogger, but we also love podcasts and we love audio and we love finding ideas and things that you're interested in and coming up with ways to build something around that. And as a history nerd myself, sometimes Ethan has to stop me on the podcast because I always have all of these lessons that I pull from because history is like the same exact thing over and over again, right? And so like there's been times where I have to be like, okay, Tim, like shut your mouth. This isn't a history podcast. This is a writing podcast. And so I am going to take full advantage of this opportunity and actually chat a little bit about some of the things that really interest me. So with that being said, there's a lot of history podcasts out there. Some of them are pretty dry. Obviously, there's like the history podcast, Hardcore History, one of the most successful podcasts ever. But you were able to create a unique spin on it where you have like this perfect little in between of being factual while also giving like your personal viewpoint on it. And what I'm getting to really is like, how on earth did this podcast come to be? Did you just wake up one day and say, I'm going to start a history podcast, or did it manifest in some kind of way?
It wasn't that different from what you said. I
Yeah.
woke up and was like, all right, history podcast, let's do it. Essentially what happened was I was actually, when I started this podcast, I was not at a good place in my life. I was the classic, like living in your parents' basement, unemployed, not going anywhere. And I had started reading a biography of Napoleon. I always like to read, and it really motivated me. It gave me this feeling of, I didn't know what to call it. I actually can talk about that feeling later. But I thought, I'd actually like to get as much as I can out of reading this because I'm enjoying it so much. I'm feeling so energized, so motivated. So I should create something from this, like a blog post or something. And actually, just fortuitously, I had a trainer at the gym whose dad had done radio. And so we were working out one day and he's like, you have a really good voice. You should consider doing radio. And so I met with his dad, and his dad was like, I'm about to retire. Do you want my audio equipment? And I said, I have no reason to, but like, sure. So I'd had that radio equipment for like a couple of years, just kind of sitting on my shelf. And so I was like, I should do something. I should make something out of this book that I'm reading so that I get the most I can out of it. I was like, I have that audio equipment. I could record something. I'll make a podcast out of it. So I threw together a little intro song, used PowerPoint, actually, of all things, to make a little cover image, and voila, a podcast was born.
Real quick question. So you have the best intro song out of any podcast ever. I know you've heard that a couple of times, but it gets me so hyped, man. Like every time your show comes on, your intro song just gets me really, really excited to listen to it. Like, you really just threw that thing together off the top of your head?
GarageBand, baby.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh man,
I'm not a music guy. That's not what I do. I do have like, I play the piano, classically trained pianist till I was 17 years old. So like, I get music a little bit, but yeah, that was just like an invention of necessity where I was like, I need a song. I found a little kit, that little beat on GarageBand, and I was like, okay, maybe I could throw some history quotes in there and it would sound epic. So I threw it in and then found that little and so I tried different notes and I found the right register that I thought sounded cool and threw it in, and it all came together. It took me like 45 minutes. What's funny too is since then people have been like, hey, you must be this amazing composer, let me hire you.
Sure.
And I've had to like give their money back. I don't know. I'm a one-hit wonder. That's all I had in me.
Whatever, one is good enough for sure. And okay, that's really interesting to hear about because obviously I thought you had experience, but it's also interesting to hear from what you're telling me, you didn't personally have any audio experience before. You just jumped into this?
Yeah. And then since then, I've gotten some more audio experience. So
for sure.
I mentioned that I was unemployed. I'd been working for a startup and actually had sold recently. So maybe it's a little disingenuous to say I was unemployed, but I didn't have a job. That is true. And I was living at home in order to save money. But so, you know, I need a new job. And I was like, oh, I wonder if I could kind of do more of this podcasting thing. So I applied to a few places. One of them got back to me and said, hey, we listened to your podcast, How to Take Over the World. I'd only done like 3 or 4 episodes. And they're like, we think this is great. Yeah, we would love to have you come produce for us. So then I started producing for that company. It's called The Mission. And then from there I was off, and I was kind of in the industry.
This is such a classic copy blogger type story, because the way that I teach it, I should say the way it happened for me, not necessarily the way I teach it. Like, I don't know anything special than anybody else. I just have my own experience, right? And it was exactly the same. I was in a terrible place in my life, and I just started writing. It was a Blogspot blog, but back when that was a thing. And I didn't tell anyone about it. I just wrote. And all of a sudden one day I'm like, holy shit, how are people reading my website? I didn't even know, I didn't tell anybody about it. Like, who are these people? And so I discovered SEO. And through that, I was able to get a little bit of SEO experience and then build an agency. And now we're here. So I love the idea of do something first and see what happens from it. It's not necessarily that you want to go in without a plan, but the point I'm trying to make is that having a skill is so valuable. And that sounds so like esoteric to say, right? But like, once you build up a particular skill, then in my experience, again, like, things just start happening for you. And it seems like that's what happened to you as well.
You know, I'm one of those people, I really believe that positioning is important.
Yeah.
And finding the right way to frame the right way to frame your media, your podcast, your blog, whatever, is really important. But it's just like you say, that doesn't mean you need to figure it out first. Just because it's important doesn't mean you need to figure it out first. And it's honestly best to just kind of get the motion down first. I tell that with people who want to launch a podcast. They're like, I don't think that I really want to start this podcast for XYZ reason, but I don't feel like I have the idea down.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the answer is don't do it. But a lot of times if they are committed to launching a podcast, the best thing to do is just start now. And you can kind of figure out the positioning once you're a few episodes in. So I agree to that, like, kind of just start principle.
Yeah, you articulated that actually better than I did. I was struggling to figure out what exactly I was trying to say. But the problem I had in my life with my overthinking, and the problem that other people had, is you have this idea of like this perfect podcast that you want to create, right? I have this message, I have this certain idea, like this feeling that I want to share with people. And when you don't nail it, which is impossible, you know, like, you never nail this vision that you have first time, then you go, oh, well, I guess it's just not worth doing. Whereas for me, the way I actually figured out what it was that I wanted to do was by like continuously stumbling forward. And then one day I was like, oh, wait, I think I'm on to something. And it's like messier and it's more uncomfortable. And it's kind of anxiety provoking, right? Because you have no idea if it's even good, but it's certainly the best way, at least in my experience, to learn.
Totally.
Okay. Next question. The Napoleon episode that you did. I love Napoleon as well. He's probably is one of the top 3 coolest people, I think, in the history of the world, just because of how weird he is and what he did. But also just because of how weird he was, with like his little obsessiveness. And I loved how you talked about the way he had his desk organized. That was always something I thought was so interesting about. He was just so obsessive with his letters and his writing. And I thought it was interesting too on your seizure episode where you said the same thing. I was like, oh, I wonder if there's like a commonality with that, with people like overly communicating with people. I thought that was interesting. But what I'm trying to make is that Napoleon episode, that was your first episode, really? That was the first one that you did?
First one I ever did. That's right.
That's really shocking because it's very good. I'm not saying that to fluff you up. Like, how long did you spend on it?
I spent not that long, actually, not as long as I spent on future episodes. When I say not that long, it was still between research and writing. It was whatever, 40, 50 hours, something like that. And actually I recorded it a few times. So, the first time I recorded it, I actually just did bullet points, and it was too long and it was too unfocused. And so then I tried refining those bullet points, and eventually I learned that I just needed to script it. And that's what I do now. I script every word. I don't necessarily read the script, but it helps me to have a script so that if I go off on tangents, I know what I'm coming back to. I have somewhere to land. So I recorded it a few times, but it was my first one.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because there's times when I listen to it where it seems like you have your facts in order. So I think he's got to have this written down. I mean, some people can memorize all those dates and stuff. I'm not one of them. But then there are other times where it feels like you're going off the cusp a little bit. So when you record it, you're almost kind of flowing in between the script and your own ideas.
That's right. So I'm reading, and usually it helps a lot when I'm doing more straight narrative, when I'm saying dates and facts, and he was born at this time, and getting through information. But then when I get to a moment that I really love, I'll just kind of black out, my eyes roll in the back of my head, and I'm just talking about the Battle of Austerlitz now, and so I'll go off script, and then it kind of ends, and I think, okay, what now? And so then I stop, and I have to kind of read through and find where I am, and then I go back to the script.
So there's a lot of editing.
Yeah. There's a ton of editing that goes on in the back end.
Do you do all the editing?
I used to. No, not anymore.
It's better that way.
I will say, if people just want to get started, Descript, which is a piece of software, has made it really easy to do your own editing, even if you're not an audio engineer, have no experience editing audio. So it's not that hard to edit your own audio these days. But yeah, I don't do it myself.
Yeah, I agree. But Descript is really cool. I would also say, just as like a little side note, that knowing how to edit is a really, really great thing to have, because there's so many people, myself included, like I just can't stand the process. I'm not like a tinkerer, I really, really can't stand it. And so I'm always looking for editors. And it sounds like that was the first thing that you got off your plate, right? Because it's very it's a mentally and like emotionally kind of exhausting, because it's so hard to decide, like, do I leave this in? Do I not? And then you start going back and forth where it's like, okay, let me see what it sounds like if I leave this in. Let me see what it sounds like if I take this out. And then before you know it, I'm lost in this world of like, where did I even begin? And I just want to hit, like Control Z 50 times and just go backwards all the way to the beginning. So it's an exhausting podcast, especially for episodes that are as long as yours.
Yeah, a good editor really is an artist. And I love the editor that I work with now. He's really, really good.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely an art to it. But the basics you can kind of figure out. You don't need a professional, but
for sure.
Yeah, I still encourage people, once you want to take it to that next level. Yeah, there's
you have to.
Yeah, you have to.
So then how did you get hooked up with Sam with the Hustle? Like how are you involved in that now?
He just listened on Spotify. I think he searched Caesar podcast or something like that. And one day I was already a listener of My First Million, which is a big entrepreneurship show that I now produce. And I'm listening to it one day, and Sam says, I found this amazing podcast called How to Take Over the World.
Wait, so you were listening to it?
I was listening to it.
No fucking way. That is so cool.
And honest to goodness, my first thought was, wow, that's crazy. There's another podcast called How to Take Over the World. And then he's like, yes, this guy, Ben Wilson. And I just, I like had an out of body experience. I felt like I was floating above my body. I couldn't, I had this just like rush that went from my head to my toes. I felt like my whole body was tingling. I couldn't believe it was happening. And then we started talking over the next few days, and that's how I got plugged in there.
Where were you when you heard it?
I was at my in-laws' house. In the summer, we were visiting Utah, where I now live, but at the time lived in Northern Virginia. And so, yeah, I was visiting my mother and father-in-law, and I was sitting outside. It was the morning, and they have like a little table outside in their backyard. And I was sitting there and doing a little email and listening to the podcast.
So you had your headphones in?
I actually didn't. I just had my phone sitting out, and I was listening out loud to my phone.
Oh my gosh, that is so cool. I'm just trying to envision that moment. Like, what did you do? Did you like run inside and freak out, or did you kind of just get stuck in like this like cerebral?
No, yeah, I started running around. I ran up to my wife. I was like, Katie, you got to listen to this. And
Oh my gosh, I love it.
yeah, it's crazy.
Wow. Okay, so what a transformation. You were in a tough spot in your life. You read a book about Napoleon. You got inspired by Napoleon's like ruthless tenacity and ambition. You did a podcast. A couple episodes later, you did a Caesar podcast. You started editing, and now you're the producer for The Hustle, and you're hanging out with Mr. Beast.
Yeah, yeah. That was another crazy one. That was another one where that time I was at home in Northern Virginia, and I looked down at my phone, and I had a Twitter notification that said, you got a DM from Mr. Beast. And again, my first thought was,
there's another Mr. Beast.
There's another Mr. Beast, but there's a lot of Mr. Beast impersonators, right? So I just assumed that I got a DM from Mr. Beast _, right? Or like underscore Mr. Beast, or just one of these jokers who's fake. So then I tapped on it and saw that it was actually him. And that time I was actually about to go to bed. I was sitting in bed. And once again, I was like, Katie, look at this. She didn't know who Mr. Beast was. And so she was like, okay. And so I started explaining to her, like, this is a big deal. This guy's the biggest YouTuber in the world. She's like, oh, wow. Called my best friend, and who was kind of my partner in crime with a bunch of stuff. And I was like, what do I do, man? What do I say? I felt like I was back in middle school, right? I was like texting him every step. I'm like, all right, what do I say now? But yeah, that's been cool.
So that's so interesting to hear, because I followed you on Twitter, and you're not very active on Twitter, so there wasn't like a whole lot to see, right? But then there was just Mr. Beast. He tweeted, go listen to How to Take Over the World. And I think you retweeted it on maybe it was your Twitter, it might have been your company Twitter. And so I assumed that you already were hooked up with Sam, and you just started the podcast because, I don't know, they're all media guys. And so you just had your own little idea. And through Sam and through the show, when they interviewed Mr. Beast, like you all hung out, and then Mr. Beast got to know you and listened to your show and then gave you a shout out. But what you're telling me is it was completely, there was no solicitation. There was no introduction. Like you got a cold DM from Mr. Beast about your podcast.
Yeah, just the opposite. I actually introduced Sam and Sean to Jimmy, to Mr. Beast.
No way.
Yeah. So it was, once again, just someone listened to it and liked it.
What did it say? Just like, hey, I love your show.
Yeah, I can actually find the DM right now. I don't remember the exact words. Let's see what he said. I'd love to chat sometime. I don't want anything. I just enjoy speaking with interesting people and would love to learn from you, add value to your life. Just hit me up if you're ever bored. So yeah. He goes on these walks on Sundays and just calls people. And so he'd been listening to my podcast. And so that Sunday he's like, I'm gonna call this Ben guy. So
and for people like not on the video right now, like you should see Ben's face. He's kind of just like, yep, that happened.
It is not that different from you, listener, whoever you are, getting that DM out of the blue. Like, I was not that big.
It's so interesting. I have this whole line of questions about the episode that you actually did do with Sam about going into the analytics and like what you think works and stuff like that. Ethan sent it to me. I'm not actually a very big podcast listener other than history podcasts. And I really mean that. I get too wrapped into like the business self-development podcast, and then everything in my life like isn't good enough. And I have all these things I need to improve. And so when I go for my walks, I usually listen to history. It kind of chills me out. And so, and so Ethan sent me that podcast where you and Sam and I think another producer, I forget his name, he's friends with Ethan. You went through all of the different ideas and things that you think work when it comes to growing a show. And so I have like a bunch of things that I lined out to talk to you, but hearing this story is such a trip. Like, what does it feel like to have gone from this idea to, I mean, you got to be top 5 history podcasts in the world right now.
Yeah. Very lucky. I feel very, very lucky.
Yeah.
I remember because I told you I got into audio production after that, which was great, but I still felt like I was grinding, right? I was making these B2B podcasts, which were fine, but I didn't necessarily get into it to make, a B2B podcast that gets 300 listeners for, XYZ Corp. Yep. with 60,000 employees or whatever. That's not why I got into it. And so when Sam shared my episode on air, I almost started crying. I was like, I'm going to make it. I'm going to be able to do this thing that I love doing for a living. I could just feel it, right? That was the moment that I knew that I was going to get to do this as an actual career. And that was a beautiful feeling.
That's so cool. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, let me get into a little bit of the specifics then. How often do you publish episodes? They're daunting episodes. There's time in between, but what's your goal there? How long are you trying to do it?
I'm trying to get it down to once every 3 weeks. I had a big ambitious goal to do it every week, and I since backed off that. I'm just trying to do once every 3-ish weeks.
Because you'd have to read so much.
I have a lot of reading, a lot of research to do.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so once every 3 weeks, and then I want to talk about one of the things that you said on the episode with Sam, where you said that you have found it's the episodes that you didn't necessarily expect to do well. They're a little bit more interesting and a little bit more outside the beaten path. You know, like when you hear history, you think, I don't know, you think George Washington, right? You think, as Americans, you think Abe Lincoln. If you're a world leader, you think of, I don't know, Gandhi, right? But you said that some of the more interesting episodes that you did and that were well received were, you know, things like Edison, who's like a huge historical figure, possibly one of the most influential people in the history of the world, right? But not a lot of people would think about him. So what's your viewpoint on that? Do you think that people are looking for something more interesting, or do you think it's that because it's more interesting, it spreads?
Well, I think there's a certain element of, look, one of the reasons, so How to Take Over the World, when it first came out, I remember being at I went to a podcast conference to try and figure this whole thing out.
Yeah.
And I'm there, and there's this representative from one of these big conglomerates, one of these big networks. And I'm telling him, you guys need to pick up my podcast. And he goes, how many listeners do you have? And I'm like, 200, maybe 300. And he's like, come on, man, why are you talking to me? You're a joker. And I'm just there, and I'm pouring my heart out, and I'm like, please, you got to listen to this podcast. Like, I know it's going to be a hit. I know it's going to be a hit. You got to listen to it. You got to pick me up. He did not listen. He did not pick me up. But I had that confidence early on, because even though I only had 200 or 300 listeners, there were people who would talk to me who would be like, hey, man, this is my favorite show. And I think that's really important, that criteria of, are you someone's favorite show, right? So that applies to episodes too, right? So for example, one episode that's done really well is about Brigham Young, who was the second leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormon Church, led 60,000 people across the plain, established the state of Utah, and built all these colonies. But kind of a niche historical figure, not a lot of people know it. But if you're Mormon, this matters a ton to you, right? And this isn't someone that you often hear featured in an episode like How to Take Over the World. And so it's really exciting. You're going to share it with your friends who are also Mormon so they can listen to it. And so it does really well. And so I think there's a little bit of that, a little bit of, it's better to have something that some people are intensely interested in than to have someone who everyone is a little bit interested in. The other thing is, yeah, like there's not a ton of content out there on Brigham Young. There is a lot of content on Caesar. I think my Caesar podcast is still pretty good, but there's a lot of good, frankly, podcasts out there about Caesar that you can find. And so you can go elsewhere for that. So yeah, I think that oftentimes content that is a little more niche can do well because you get those really passionate fans who share it.
I think that there's two things that come to mind. One, when you created the Brigham Young episode, did you specifically think, I'm going to make an episode that Mormons are going to share with themselves, or did you just have a really cool story that you wanted to put out there?
No, yeah, I tried a couple times doing episodes specifically for the purpose of like targeting a certain audience.
It never works, right?
And no, yeah, exactly.
No.
So I now have made a rule for myself that I am only doing episodes on the person who I find just the most interesting, that I'm just fixated on, fascinated by, can't help myself, have to do this research. So that's what it was with Brigham Young.
Yeah, that's something that I have learned from experience as well, just about how unpredictable it all is. Like nobody has any idea what they're talking about. And I really mean that. Everyone is just thinking like, hey, this is a good idea. Let me try it. Let me see how it works. And a good example of that for me is Twitter. Um, at COVID, like everybody else, I said, hey, fuck it. Why don't I try to get Twitter followers for some reason? I don't even know why I wanted to do that, but it seemed like a cool idea. And I have no idea why some things do well and other things don't do well. Like there is absolutely no reason. And so I really do agree that approaching it with that viewpoint of let me just make as much cool stuff as I possibly can. And then eventually something will take off. So co-signed. Um, More of like a personal question. What is your favorite episode that you've done?
My favorite episode, this is a bad answer. So I'll give you my bad answer first, then I'll try and think more. My favorite podcast is always the most recent one I did.
Yeah.
Right. Because what I'm obsessed with right now. So right now I'm obsessed with Brigham Young. I want to know everything about him. And I love it. Like I love it. The research doesn't feel like work. It's great. It's so cool. So, but as soon as I do another episode, it'll be someone else.
Mm-hmm.
If I have to rule out Brigham Young, I really love the Thomas Edison episodes.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons is that one surprised me a little bit. That was actually someone I was not planning on doing an episode on, and just started doing a little research. And then I found this one story that blew my mind. And
What was it?
it was actually when he discovered recorded sound. What everyone knows him for is the light bulb. The light bulb is definitely his most world-changing invention. That is true. But he didn't truly invent the light bulb. Everyone was working on the light bulb. Light bulbs already existed. They just weren't commercially viable. So what he figured out was how to make the light bulb work in a way that actually got light into people's homes. So I think it is proper to say that he invented the light bulb, but it wasn't a technology that came out of nowhere. On the other hand, when he discovered recorded sound, what he was doing was he wasn't even working on the problem, right? He was working on, he was working on a separate problem, which is there a way that we can almost do automatic dictation, right? Have someone speak into a machine, and it's something that would take hundreds of years to actually develop, that we now need artificial intelligence for, but like have it transcribe what you say as you say it. And so he's thinking, okay, well, maybe if we are able to write down the vibrations somehow, and so they're recording it, and he's got this needle going in copper to record the vibrations as he's speaking. And he's just sitting there with his machinist who's helping him. The guy's name was Batchelor, was his last name. He says Batch.
He's a real genius.
Yeah, a real genius himself.
Yeah.
Edison couldn't have done a lot of the stuff he did without him. And he goes, Batch, what if you pull that backwards and vibrate the needle going in the opposite direction? Would it play the sound back? And he's like, I don't know. Let me try it. And he pulls on the copper, and all of a sudden he hears himself say, Mary had a little lamb.
Yeah.
And it's the first time anyone's heard recorded sound. People start losing their minds, right? This is just like something that dropped out of nowhere, like an atomic bomb, like a revelation from God. And that story was so cool to me that I was like, all right, I gotta learn more about this Edison guy. So that's what got me into that episode. And I ended up, it surprised me so much. I knew so little about his story that I really loved it.
There was a part of that episode that I thought you did a really great job articulating on, which is what that would do to the regular person who all of the sudden could hear something that they said even 10 seconds ago. We really take it for granted now, but I'll go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. I remember Elon Musk was talking about all his brain chips and the crazy shit that he talks about, and how even when people die today, there's like a weird ghost of them left over with all of the things that they've said and all the pictures and their like digital representation, right? It was when all the metaverse talk was really going on. I remember thinking about that. Like, yeah, it is a strange thing. I've had friends that died, and their Facebook page is still up, and you look at it, it's like, wow, you're still kind of here in a weird way. And when you said in that episode about how it'd be like talking to a ghost, where for the first time ever, let's say you have a relative that just says hi, and then all of a sudden 5 years from now you can do a weird thing and it's your relative's voice that doesn't even exist anymore, but quite literally, excuse me, this person's voice still exists. And the thought of that and what Edison created with that was a real trip. I remember listening to it, just being like, wow, like how crazy would that have been to have experienced that firsthand?
Right. And to be clear, that's not necessarily my original thought. It's what everyone said at the time, which is so
Yeah.
interesting to me, that that's human nature. That the first thought everyone had when they heard recorded sound was not think of what we could do with music, think about what we could do with sending messages via voice. Everyone's first thought, not everyone's first thought, but like one of the overriding first thoughts is we could hear dead people. And that just like yearning, that mourning, that like human connection, that wanting to recover what was lost is so interesting to me. I think if you want to experience a little bit what that must have felt like to them, you should go listen to this new project where, have you heard this? They did the Joe Rogan interview with Steve Jobs.
Oh, I have, yeah, and it's totally it didn't happen. It's a made up conversation.
Yeah, it's a made up conversation, right?
Yeah.
They used AI to generate a podcast interview between Steve Jobs and Joe Rogan. It sounds just like Steve Jobs, right? The
So
AI is so
weird.
good. And it's weird because it's generating like newish insights. It's taking stuff that Steve Jobs said and saying stuff that's very similar to what he would, that stuff very similar to stuff he said and kind
Yeah.
of like what he would have said. But it sounds like new stuff that Steve Jobs is saying. And that's another one of those you hear it for the first time and you're like, wow, this is spooky. It feels like someone reaching from beyond the grave. And once again, that was kind of our first thought, right? This is one of the first kind of innovations with this new AI technology. And one of the
Yeah.
first things we're doing is reaching beyond the grave and trying to resurrect someone who's dead.
So cool. I'm glad to hear you say the Edison episode. I really enjoyed it. My favorite one is Philip II. Other than Genghis Khan, because everybody loves Genghis Khan, even though it's like a terrible thing to love, but it's just mind blowing that one person could do that in a lifetime, you know? Other than Genghis Khan, Philip II is by far my favorite. He is just so freaking cool. And I love that even though he was like a ruthless warrior, he was always like really classy. And I don't even know how to explain it. He was just that dude that showed up at a party that everybody thought was cool. And he didn't have to really act cool. He just
Right.
was cool. You know,
Yes.
I love Philip II.
Yeah. One of those people who's so rare to meet in life, who could charm the most educated, refined, aristocratic person you could imagine,
Yeah.
and then charm the just most base, disgusting, dirty soldier in his army, right? Just had that ability to connect with anyone from any station of life, and then had the brilliance to back it up and the military acumen. I just love, he's kind of that like true Renaissance man, right?
For sure.
And I love that one as well.
Yeah. That's really cool. All right. I'll wrap up on one more concept that you talk about, and I'm going to put you on the spot here. I hope it's not too much. I couldn't find what you actually said about it, but in, again, that podcast with you and Sam, you spoke about how you heard somebody else spoke about these like weird 4 or maybe it was 3 criteria that you need to have a successful podcast. One of them was like, is there people that listen to it? One of them might've been, is it interesting? Another one might've been like, is it do something in a different way? I really, really can't remember, but you spoke about it for a long time. And I'm hoping you remember it well enough to replay it back to us.
So I use this framework. I get a lot of people that talk to me that want to talk about starting a podcast.
Yeah.
And so I tell them this framework a lot. And I think it works for almost anything, whether it's a YouTube channel, a podcast,
I do too.
blog. And so the framework is this: if you want to have a hit podcast, it needs to be differentiated in 2 areas. You choose 2 from these 4 areas. Here are the 4 areas in which it can be different: what it's about, the actual content, the subject matter of the podcast, who's telling the story, in other words, who you are, and then who the audience is, who it's for, and the 4th is how you tell the story. So if I am making a podcast for firemen, maybe there are no podcasts about fireman, about the life of a firefighter, right? Or if there are, then I need to find something that's more differentiated, right, in terms of what it's about. So maybe it's not about just the life of a firefighter. Maybe it's about firefighting technology, right? And I'm going to be the podcast where I help firefighters figure out what equipment they need, right? But you need to find that, you could find that niche of what it's about. Again, who it's for. Now, if we're talking about firemen, that's kind of a binary, right? Of if there are already podcasts for firefighters, and that's not really differentiated. Or if it is, again, you can maybe try and be a little more niche of actually, maybe I'm a podcast for female firefighters. I probably wouldn't do that. But maybe it's a podcast for, once you go to the technology angle, right? Like not just firefighters, but like firefighters who just aren't there for the job, but actually want to be like cutting edge, right? Those guys who want to like push the envelope in firefighting. Okay. That's one way you can differentiate the audience, or you could differentiate who you are. That's, again, once you either are that person or are not, but maybe you yourself are a firefighter. Okay, that's good. Maybe you yourself, have won some contests or have some sort of something that sets you apart as a particularly excellent firefighter. I think this one is the biggest pitfall, actually, the who you are, because people go, well, I'm really interesting and dynamic, so that differentiates me. I'm like, okay, but you realize that there are a lot of podcasts out there from like professional comedians, right? From like Malcolm Gladwell, from people who are
like from Malcolm Gladwell,
like the most interesting, the most funny in the world. Like on that battlefield, do you really stand out? Like, does that really differentiate your podcast? So I'd say be very careful with that one. You really need to be differentiated and dynamic and whatever if you're going to go with that one.
Well, hold on. Excuse me to interrupt you. Like, can we talk about this one for a little bit? Because how else could you differentiate yourself as a person other than being dynamic? Like, if you're breaking down this framework and I have a skill and there's something I want to talk about, but I'm not like very hip, I'm not very charismatic. I think Lex Friedman is a perfect example of this. Like, he's like a terrible podcast host, but there's something about him that makes him, I don't know, you gravitate towards him. So how would you break that down in a way that makes it more digestible?
Yeah. So one thing I would say is, for most people, skip this one, differentiate yourself in other dimensions, right?
Yeah, true.
But the other thing I would say is, number one, is there something about you that is genuinely unique? Okay. So you can look for that. Just look. I actually don't think that this is one of the ones that I differentiate my podcast on. But if I had to say something about me that makes me unique, it's not actually that I'm the most dynamic, the most interesting. I don't have that like all over the place register. Like I could honestly do better about being interesting that way. But my shtick kind of is, people find me very soothing. People find me very easy to listen to. And so I could lean into that more, right? Yeah. Like if that was going to be my point of differentiation of like, okay, I'm the soothing guy who you can just kind of relax and listen to, right? Yeah. And so that's what I would do if I were trying to differentiate there. So yeah, the first thing is just kind of like really self-analyze about yourself. What is it that sets you apart? And then two is, you can learn to be more interesting. There are things that you can do to learn how to speak better, to learn how to lean into certain elements of your personality, to make yourself more interesting if you want.
Yeah, but I think you said it really well. Like, most of the time, skip that one. And as soon as you said that, I was like, oh yeah, like Lex Friedman isn't interesting because he's dynamic. Is interesting because he's a computer scientist and he loves astrophysics. And so everything that he brings to the conversation has this weird, unique approach that has something to do with his personality. So as soon as you said that, I was like, oh yeah, definitely. Just skip that one.
Yeah, like it's kind of like you have it or you don't, for the most part. Like I said, you can lean into it a little bit if you're almost there. But for the most part, if it doesn't immediately occur to you, like, oh yeah, I'm a jiu-jitsu fighting astrophysicist, therefore, like I'm a Navy SEAL, I'm inherently an interesting person. If that doesn't like jump off the page to you, then just like go, you're gonna need to find something else.
Yeah. And so I cut you off. So we did, what is it about?
What is it about?
Who's it
who
for?
You are,
and
who
then
the
how
audience
to tell
is,
the story.
And how to tell the story is the fourth one. Yep. How you tell the story. And so for a lot of people, this is what you're going to have to rely on. I'd say the most easy combination, it's not that easy, but the most easy combination is what it's about and how you tell the story, because you have complete control over that, right? You can on a certain level, you just tell the story super well, go find a way to tell the story that no one has told that story before. And that's what I did, right? These famous biographies, people had told these biographies, but no one had done it from a perspective of, what can I take away from this? How can I improve after learning some of these stories? So I think for most people, the telling the story in a different way should be one of those pillars.
Yeah, especially because there's no limitation to combining those two. There's infinite options. And I think a perfect example, and I wish you would do this more often, honestly. I'm not saying this to critique your show. It stood out to me so much as oh my God, that is a way to nail a differentiation where you always do the history, let's just tell the story, right? And then at the end of it, you give some reflections about what you learned from this person. And there was 1 or 2 episodes, it might have been in the beginning, where you said, so if you want to take over the world, you need to blah, blah, blah. And then you listed off these personality traits. And I as soon as you said that, I remember thinking oh man, that is such a good, it's like an arrow right in the bullseye, because you could say it every single time. It's so if you want to take over the world, then you need to do all of these things. And I think what I'm getting at is that's a really perfect example about you're telling a story in a different way. It's a story that's been told plenty of times. I mean, who knows how many books have been written about Napoleon, right? But nobody has ever actually taken it from the context of here's how Napoleon took over the world. If you want to take over the world, then do it like this.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
I think, look, people can get really bogged down in this exercise.
Yeah.
Like we were saying earlier, you don't have to do this necessarily before you start, if that makes sense. You can get started, you can start a podcast, you can start a blog. Maybe you've already got a few posts or a few episodes out, and now you're thinking, okay, this isn't getting perfect traction. I need to differentiate a little more, and that's fine. And this is a really helpful exercise that you can just improve your positioning as you go, to make sure. And once you do, you'll really have that product market fit. And like I said, for me, that indicator is, are people telling me, oh, this is my favorite show? Even if you only have a few listeners, if of those 20 listeners, 3 of them are I can't get enough. This, I listen to every word you say. This is my favorite show. Boom, you got it. Just keep putting out content. It's going to get there. Someday it's going to find a way.
Be somebody's favorite. Amazing. Well, Ben, you got a brand new family. I know that you got a lot going on right now, so I really appreciate you taking the time. Man, just thank you. Really, I'm really happy for you. Again, just congratulations on all you've done. It is an awesome show, and I say that sincerely as somebody who just enjoys the podcast for what it is, but also loves these. Well, they're not characters; these figures, and loves the way that you tell it. Congratulations! It was really great talking to you.
Thanks. It's been fun to chat. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Tim.
Likewise. Thanks everybody for listening. If you want to support the show, give us a subscribe, give us a rating on iTunes. It's the best thing you can do to help us out. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you next time. See ya.